On September the 14th last, one of the retaining columns of the newly opened Penderdome shopping precinct in Fulchester collapsed, and 8 people were killed. As a result of the report of the official inquiry into the disaster, Joseph Carney, site agent at the Penderdome shopping centre at the time of its construction, is accused of murder or manslaughter. Mr. O'Connor appears for the defence, and Mr. Lloyd appears for the prosecution. The case, involving as it does questions of modern architectural techniques and public building generally, is attracting wide attention. Currently in the witness box is Mr. Ramsay Bellenden, chairman of the committee which reported on the accident. Mr. Justice Campbell presides in the case of the Queen against Carney.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Bellenden. No further questions.
Mr. Bellenden, you tell us that your investigation revealed that the principal retaining column in the south tower of the Penderdome shopping centre shifted from position because it had been improperly secured at the time of construction.
Yes, that is correct.
Where was the column situated exactly?
Well,
if you show us on the model, please.
The 3 towers were referred to as west, east, and south. The column in question, known as column A, was situated inside the south tower here. It was one of 3 columns which gave main support to the dome.
I see. Now, how is it you can state with such confidence that this column had been improperly secured at the time of construction?
Well, the column came down to a square plate at the base. 4 giant anchor bolts were meant to tie it to the foundation pad. Well, the anchoring simply hadn't been carried out correctly. The bolts tore out as though they were matchsticks.
Might the effect arguably have been the same if the column had simply buckled in position?
There was never any question of the column buckling.
And that's beyond all question too, is it?
I'm afraid I don't quite understand what you're trying to say.
Well, I'm putting it to you, Mr. Bellenden, that had the column been properly secured and then buckled, you would still have observed that the bolts tore out like matchsticks.
Well,
yes or no, if you please?
It's not quite as simple as that.
Is it not, Mr. Bellenden?
It's very hard to see how the bolts tore out at all, unless there had been a failure to secure the nuts which gave it the right tension, and always granted that the plate had been correctly levelled. However, if the column had been properly secured and then buckled, as you suggest, one would have thought that the break would occur at the stress point. The column would snap.
Yet it could happen that the bolts would tear out.
It would be a freak effect.
But it could happen. Now, this column that was at fault then, what was it made of? Steel?
No, not steel, not exactly.
Not exactly, Mr. Bellenden.
Well, steel was the matrix. A complex of inorganic fibres had been added to the steel, however, to form a new compound of outstanding mechanical strength.
And this was called?
Well, I could give you a complicated chemical formula. It was known as the trade as KK9, King Kong muscle to many builders. It's a comparatively new material, only been available commercially for the last 2 or 3 years. It had a support power 12 times that of conventional steel.
That's your opinion, is it, Mr. Bellenden?
It's more than my opinion. Tests have been made at the Building Research Establishment, and there were specifications as laid down in the Agreement Board certificate.
Yes, Mr. O'Connor, Mr. Lloyd, if there is to be some question as to the precise efficacy of this King Kong muscle, should we not have the documents to which the witness has just referred?
Yes, with respect, my lord, we already have them. Yes, they're in the bundle of agreed documents.
Yes, of course. Then, Mr. O'Connor, you agree the Agreement Board tests and specifications, you do not dispute them?
We agree, my lord, that the Agreement Board conducted tests and issued specification for King Kong muscle. Whether it was acting wisely or unguardedly or giddily even is, of course, another matter altogether.
Giddily? I see.
So you have faith in King Kong muscle?
I have no reason not to.
Mr. Bellenden, to your knowledge, has any King Kong muscle marketed been found to be substandard?
No, I've never heard of a case.
Well, if such a case had occurred, would your attitude to King Kong mussel be different?
That is a hypothetical question. I'd have to look at the facts.
Yes. Only one more question, as it happens, Mr. Bellenden. As an expert in the construction field, can you tell us why, if King Kong mussel possesses all the virtues which you claim for it, it's not more widely used in building work across the country?
I have no information as to how widely or restrictedly King Kong mussel is actually used. Of course, it's very expensive to produce.
Thank you, Mr. Bellenden. No further questions.
No re-examination, my lord.
Well, gentlemen.
I call John Vincent Claudius.
John Vincent Claudius, please.
What is your religion?
I would prefer to affirm.
Read aloud the words on this card.
I do solemnly, sincerely, and truly declare and affirm that the evidence I shall give shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
You are John Vincent Claudius of 4
Excuse
Laverock
me.
Mews, London. Sorry?
Claudius.
Oh, I see, I'm sorry. You are John Vincent Claudius of 4 Laverock Mews, London, NW3.
That is correct.
What is your profession, please?
Architect, graduate Lund University, registered in this country. Senior partner, Claudius International Associates.
I see. Now, have you a connection with the Penderdome Shopping Centre?
Yes, I designed the Penderdome Shopping Centre. About 5 years ago now, Fulchester Council organized a competition among selected architects for a project of this nature. I was invited to submit a design, and this design was chosen.
I see. Would you please come forward to the model of the Penderdome, please, Mr. Claudius?
Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Now, are you acquainted with the accused in this case?
I am, yes.
On January the 10th, did you visit the construction site, January the 10th last year?
Yes, that was the date that column A was being set into position. That's this column here. I should point out that column A is one of the columns that was to take the main weight of the dome when that also was put into position. Yes?
Yes, now, could it have, in any sense, have been said then that on January the 10th, Joseph Carney, as site agent, was faced with any particularly complex constructional problems?
Oh, no. You see, the thing you have to bear in mind when you talk about the Penderdome Shopping Centre is that the techniques involved were kept deliberately, well, you could almost say dogmatically simple. It was like an exercise in the first principles of construction, really, just the classical pendentive of basic architecture taken through to a logical conclusion.
Yes, now, did you speak to Joseph Carney at the building site on that day, Mr. Claudius?
Yes, I did, yes.
Will you tell us of that conversation, please?
Well, it was about 11 o'clock in the morning. I was taking a walk past the south tower of the dome here, and I noticed they were just about to winch column A into position, and, of course, Joe Carney was overseeing this work. I happened to remark quite casually, asked him if everything was going all right, and he said that no, it wasn't.
No, it wasn't.
Yes, he seemed upset about something, agitated, yes?
Yes.
At one point, he looked at his watch and ran off into his hut to make a telephone call, as it turned out. I could just make out his voice as he spoke on the line, set at a higher pitch than was normal, angry.
Yes. Did you actually hear what Mr. Carney was saying on the telephone, Mr. Claudius?
Well, not with all the noise that was going on around. It was difficult. I just made out the odd phrase, something about, well, where is she? I must talk to her. I can't do anything else until I have.
Well, where is she? I must talk to her, and I can't do anything else until I have.
Yeah.
Go on, please. What happened next?
Well, Joe came back out of the hut. He was, he was trembling by this time. For something to say, I said, yeah, you know, Joe, we are making architectural history here today. 10 years ago, this would have been thought impossible, building a main support column as simply as this.
I see. And did Mr. Carney make any comment on this?
Comment? I do feel I should point out here that nothing that was said was necessarily meant. The man was in obviously very bad state
yes,
of mind.
Yes, please, Mr. Claudius, just what Carney said to you.
Well, he sounded off, yes, I think that's the way you would describe it. He said...
Yes, what did he say?
He said, and that's progress, is it? That's your damned socialism, most like. I call it a bloody waste of the ratepayers' money myself. If I had half a chance, I would save...
If I had half a chance, I'd save the country what it's all costing. I'd do for it.
That's your damned socialism. I call it a bloody waste of ratepayers' money myself. Those are the exact words that Joseph Carney used to you on the morning of January the 10th. It was about the time the A column of the South Tower was being placed in position, Mr. Claudius.
Yes, as far as it's possible to remember exact words, of course.
And were the features of the Pentadome which had given rise to great expense?
Well, there was the question of the exact nature of the light beneath the dome. The enduring greyness of the British climate doesn't exactly make for a gay, colourful market atmosphere, so I decided to use angled and tinted acrylic in the dome in order to create a sense of warm glow permanently beneath.
This was costly.
Oh, well, it had to be paid for. Are we supposed to be discussing the budget here today?
In general terms, Mr. Claudius.
I'm afraid I don't
Were
see
there
what this
not
has to do
also
with
what you might call integrist socialist ideas behind the concept of the Pentadome shopping centre?
My lord, these questions seem to me to be entirely irrelevant. What earthly difference can it make whether the ideas behind the concept of the Pentadome were integrist socialist or outer Mongolian nationalist?
My lord, I'm anxious to show that when he said what he did to Mr. Claudius, the accused was making a comment upon a real and not an illusory situation. There were integrist and socialist ideas behind the Pentadome shopping centre, and my client both perceived and disliked them, hence his outburst.
Yet can a building express a political philosophy, Mr. O'Connor? I must confess that I wouldn't have thought so, but no doubt that is my Philistinism.
Oh, not necessarily, my lord. I beg your pardon. What I mean to say is it's sometimes quite difficult to explain what a building is precisely trying to say. I agree. But in the case of the Pentadome, I would have thought it was obvious. Of course it's socialist architecture. I share the socialist convictions of the council who employed me to do the work and quite naturally involved these in the Pentadome.
My congratulations, Mr. Claudius.
Thank you.
But since this point has assumed some importance, perhaps you could tell the court what in the Pentadome is so specifically socialist that the accused both perceived and became agitated by it.
Well, the keynotes of socialist architecture might be taken to be universality of function and simplicity of form. Now, when I say this, I mean that a building has to be a building for everybody, not just the aristocratic, as in an extravaganza like the Palace of Versailles, for example, or necessarily uniquely the religious, as in your own St. Paul's Cathedral. And then the form should follow this function, no unnecessary frills or ornamentation. The materials used should be the simplest, suitable for the job, all expressing the basic notion of power residing with the people. So
Like the King Kong muscle in the Pentadome, perhaps?
Well, as it happens, you chose almost a perfect example there. Yes, you see, in old forms of architecture, they would have erected ponderous bastions to support the weight of a dome such as this. Castle keeps. Quite the wrong symbolism. With our concepts, we managed to cut the supports down to functional struts, simple power, plain and obvious for all to see.
The King Kong muscle in the Pentadome was deliberately used then to make an ideological point, was it, Mr. Claudius?
If you so wish, yes.
And despite the fact that it was inexcusably expensive, couldn't absolutely be said to suit the structure better than bastions or castle keeps, and to say the least was an experimental material to use in such a manner.
What did you say?
Well, you don't deny the use of King Kong muscle in the Pentadome increased the costs enormously, Mr. Claudius, without much justification.
We had very special problems here. We had to solve them.
Special ideological requirements, you said. You also don't deny that before the Pentadome, no building had depended exclusively on King Kong muscle for its main support.
But don't you see, this was entirely the point
you
we were
still
trying to make.
retain absolute confidence in King Kong muscle as the main support material,
yes,
do
of course.
you?
I don't understand the question. What are you talking about?
Well, simply that a building designed by you, constructed to depend exclusively on King Kong muscle, collapsed only 4 months after completion, killing 8 people.
This had absolutely nothing to do with KK9. Look, the simple reason has to be that the main support column was wrongly constructed at the time the dome was put up and later moved, causing the collapse.
Yet you have told us, Mr. Claudius, as site agent, the accused hadn't a really difficult job in installing that column on that day.
Yes, this is true.
Well, then how then could he have failed to secure it properly? Have you asked yourself that?
I don't have to ask myself that. Look, the bolts holding the base plate in position tore away, yes? Okay, this can only mean one thing, that the nuts beneath had been improperly adjusted. Carney's responsibility.
There are other interpretations.
Not that KK9 was to blame.
Yeah, King Kong muscle still isn't widely used in the construction industry, is it, Mr. Claudius?
Oh, I don't know. I don't have...
you admit that it isn't widely used.
Well, perhaps not. People don't move with the times.
People like you, Mr. Claudius. Why, in fact, is it that you yourself haven't used King Kong muscle, nor prescribed its use in any work undertaken since the Penderdome? Or is my information wrong on that point? Mr. Claudius? Very well. In describing the Penderdome for us earlier, you stressed its simplicity of form and said it was just the classical pendentive of basic architecture taken to its logical conclusion.
Yes, this is true.
Well, I'm sorry. What is the classical pendentive of basic architecture?
Well, not to be too technical about it, it is in fact the skeleton or framework upon which, under some circumstances, a dome might be constructed.
Would you draw it for us, please?
It's important to your case, Mr. O'Connor.
I believe the jury should have the fullest understanding possible of these matters, my lord. I've arranged for the necessary apparatus.
Very well, if you would be so kind, Mr. Claudius.
Don't mess about with this nonsense. Get him to
We're
say
just
why
biding our time, Mr.
do your
Carney.
job properly and ask him.
Would you keep quiet, please? Thank you. Now, as I see it, the dome there rests on a massive, thick base, which in turn rests on heavy piers below.
Yes, that's the way it was in Roman and Byzantine architecture.
All that support was thought necessary to hold the dome up, in other words.
Well, of course, in those days they didn't have the
Mr.
techniques
Claudius,
that we
would you
have.
now draw your adaptation of the classical pendentive as you applied it to the Penderdome, please?
I don't have to draw this adaptation there, it is in front of
Would you draw it for us, please? Oh, yes. The massive quality is gone and there are no piers below. Well, you're not asking the jury to believe that structure will support the same weight of dome, are you?
Yes, of course I am. I hope I'm not here to defend first principles in architecture. Bulk is only necessary where you have no integral strength of material. For God's sake, William Le Jenny was proving this in Chicago as late ago as the 90s of the last century.
Well, the integral strength of the new and untried material known as King Kong muscle becomes extremely important to our case, then, doesn't it, Mr. Claudius?
For the winter, don't you understand? KK9 had its agreement specification. I used it because it was the perfect material for my dome, and I would use it again.
But in fact, you're not using it again, are you, Mr. Claudius? Or would you now answer the question I put to you a few minutes earlier?
Well, I don't understand the question.
Mr. Claudius, have you used King Kong muscle since the collapse of the Penderdome?
No, the occasion has not arisen.
Mr. Claudius, is it the fact that at a point after it was too late to replace the King Kong muscle in the Penderdome, you and certain others involved began to have doubts about its reliability? And then when something disastrous happened, you and certain others needed someone to blame for a bad mistake.
My lord, this is an outrageous
I think that
accusation.
Mr. Claudius understands. Joseph Carney, with his unsympathetic ideas, is drawing attention to the amount of money that was being spent to produce an ideological synthetic. And then, of course, his most convenient outburst on the day the A column was being placed in position. He makes a marvellous scapegoat, doesn't he? A curious alternative would seem to be to convince the jury that those spindly structures could ever be composed of material strong enough to support a huge dome. Do you really think the jury will believe that, Mr. Claudius? Claudius? Do you really believe it yourself anymore?
You're Ambrose Foster Sefton, and you live at 71 Albertson Avenue, Fulchester.
That is so.
What is your occupation, please?
I have my own business consultancy firm. I have been, in addition, for many years associated with local government. For the past 6 years, I have been chairman of the Greater Fulchester Development Committee.
Yes, now in that latter capacity, were you concerned with the Penderdome Shopping Centre?
Yes, my committee authorised its construction.
Now, as chairman of the Greater Fulchester Development Committee, did you give evidence at the Bellenden public inquiry which was held into the collapse?
I did.
It was not in any way suggested by that inquiry that you'd taken unnecessary risks by choosing a daring architectural design or by employing novel materials, or indeed anything like that.
No, certainly not.
Yes, thank you. Now, I want to come to the date of January the 10th last year, when the Penderdome was still in the course of construction. Now, did you have occasion to visit the construction site on that day?
Yes, now, January the 10th was the date of one of my regular tours of inspection. As was my normal habit on these occasions, I had lunch with Mrs. Jean Ryder before being taken round to be shown how work was progressing.
Yes, Mrs. Jean Ryder being...
the managing director of Helleby's, the construction people.
Yes, I see. Please go on.
Well, I was a bit annoyed with Mrs. Ryder on this occasion. For some time, I hadn't felt that work on the Penderdome was going as fast as it might. And when I brought up the subject over lunch, she didn't seem anxious to discuss the matter. I therefore determined, when going round the site, to find out if I could from some other officials why there seemed to be a certain tardiness.
Yes, did you visit the work on the south tower of the Penderdome on that day, Mr. Sefton?
Yes, they had the A column in position as I came up. It was resting firmly on its plate. They were beginning to tension the bolts.
Yes, I see. What time was this? Do you remember?
2:45, 3 o'clock.
2:45, 3 o'clock. Thank you. Go on, please.
Well, just at this moment, Mrs. Ryder was called away on urgent business. It seemed a heaven-sent opportunity. So I put my query about the pace of work in general to the site agent, who happened at that moment to be standing next to me.
Do you see that same individual in this court today, Mr. Sefton?
Yes, he is the accused, Joseph Carney.
Please continue.
Well, he didn't respond too courteously to my polite inquiry. That's putting it very mildly. I even got the impression...
Yes, Mr. Sefton?
Well, I have to say, I smelt drink on his breath.
Tomorrow we return to the Crown Court as the hearing continues in the case of the Queen against Carney.